Good morning, everyone, and welcome. Thank you for joining us today for this important panel, Forging Peace in Ukraine, US Strategy, Russian Calculus, and Turkey's Role. We are now in the fourth year of the war in Ukraine, and while the Trump administration is pushing for an immediate peace deal, the reality on the ground remains still difficult. Russia insists that some Ukrainian regions must be part of any settlement, while Ukraine stands firm on defending all of its territory. At the same time, the United States is getting more involved in Ukraine's future, not just in defense, but also economically, with a new agreement to support its post-war recovery. And especially in the last couple of days, there's significant developments in regards to the possibility of having a summit meeting between Zelensky and Putin in Istanbul. There's still uncertainty about that. We know that President Zelensky invited Putin to Istanbul. And yesterday, President Trump signaled that he might be in Istanbul on Thursday, following his trip in the Middle East. But we are still not sure about if the meeting is going to happen. Of course, amid this, Turkey has taken a unique role. It remains one of the few countries able to speak with both sides and has worked to mediate since the early days of the war. Today, our panel will try to explore the big questions. What does the US want in Ukraine? What are Russia's real goals? And can Turkey help move us closer to a ceasefire deal that may lead to a peace agreement? And we are honored to have a group of experts with us to discuss these issues with us. And thank you for being here. We have Luke Coffey, Senior Fellow on Center on Europe and Eurasia from Hudson Institute, Ambassador John Herbst, Senior Director, Eurasia Center, Atlantic Council, and Mark Katz, Professor Emeritus of Government and Politics from George Mason University and non-resident scholar at Atlantic Council. Shall we start with you, Ambassador? Tell us your perspective about the state of the crisis and war between Ukraine and Russia right now.
Well, it's relatively easy to explain, very difficult to predict. The Trump administration would like to achieve, as soon as possible, a sustainable peace, or at least a sustainable ceasefire. And they've laid out relatively clearly terms requiring compromise from both sides. For Ukraine, it's accepting Russian control of Ukrainian territory, and certainly a 20-year hiatus, if not longer, on joining NATO. For Russia, it requires acceptance to deter future Russian aggression, deployment of European troops to Ukraine, and arming Ukraine to the teeth, including with American weapons. Zelensky has largely accepted these terms months ago. And specifically, he accepted without quibble the overall ceasefire that Trump proposed in the middle of March. Moscow has rejected these terms in principle and in fact. They rejected the general ceasefire. They even rejected the naval ceasefire, which was not particularly good for Ukraine, which Ukraine accepted a month after Russia rejected the general ceasefire. And the Russians were deeply concerned when Zelensky pulled off a rather shrewd maneuver, inviting the leaders of Germany, France, Poland, and the UK to Ukraine last week, where they said, we'd like to see a general ceasefire agreed to by Monday, yesterday. Otherwise, we will impose major sanctions. Putin had the bright idea of trying to use the Americans to get in the way of this ceasefire. And that's when he proposed that he and Zelensky meet to talk about the peace deal, no ceasefire, in Ankara, excuse me, not Ankara, in Istanbul. And Zelensky originally said no straight away, but then Trump expressed enthusiasm for this idea, and Zelensky said yes. And then suddenly Putin decided it was not such a great idea. He let the world know this yesterday. And the Russian media even suggested that this concept of a meeting in Turkey, which was Putin's idea, was actually a Zelensky proposal. So this is where we are today. This demonstrates that Russia's not interested in a ceasefire because Putin thinks he can make further territorial gains in Ukraine. And Putin's objective is not to have the validation of the current Ukrainian soil he controls. He wants effective political control of Ukraine, which means he needs Kyiv, he needs Odessa, he needs Kherson, he needs Zaporizhia, and let's throw in for good measure, at a minimum, Kharkiv. And obviously he has neither of those cities, none of those cities. And he is hoping that with the United States heading off in an idiosyncratic direction, that we, the United States, will stop sending arms to Ukraine. Although Trump should have, you might say, disabused Putin of that notion when he agreed on the minerals deal, which spoke about the possibility of future American weapons going to Ukraine. And then you had two quick decisions from the Trump team permitting new supplies of American weapons to Ukraine. That's where we are today.
Thank you, Ambassador. And Luke, your take of the state of the crisis right now.
Thanks for inviting me to participate in this. And I largely agree with what Ambassador Herbst said. Maybe I could add a few other points to it. The Ukrainians right now want a fair peace. They don't want to surrender. And for them, a fair peace would be any outcome or end of hostilities that recognizes Ukraine's territorial integrity, to include Crimea and the 4 partially occupied oblasts of Luhansk, Donetsk, Zaporizhia, and Kherson. A formal non-recognition pledge would be enough for Ukraine in this sense. They accept that parts of these oblasts and Crimea will be under de facto Russian control. They just don't want any formal recognition of these territories being Russian. And then they would like to see emphasis placed on the return of Ukrainian children and POW swaps. Now, the latter issue, POW swaps, I don't think will be a contentious one. Returning Ukrainian children back to their homeland will probably be more difficult. But nevertheless, they view this as being crucial to having a fair and just peace. And then you have the sticky issue of security guarantees, where I think that Turkey could play a role. Obviously, the Trump administration has shown no desire or willingness to have U.S. boots on the ground. But this doesn't mean that a strategy can't be pursued where Ukraine, I wouldn't want to say security guarantee, but is more secure. And this would include, in my opinion, some sort of civilian unarmed monitoring mission on both sides of the line of occupation. It would include that from countries or organizations that both sides, Ukraine and Russia, might be able to trust. It would include European boots on the ground from the UK, from France, from Germany, from other countries, including, I would say, Turkey. It would include a U.S. role, which I describe as over the horizon. So intelligence sharing, maybe some enablers such as air-to-air refueling, maybe even having earmarked U.S. troops on standby in case there is a breakout in fighting, but not having those U.S. troops inside Ukraine, because politically this won't happen under the Trump administration. Although you could restart the California National Guard State Partnership Program, where the California National Guard does go back to Ukraine for limited training in Western Ukraine. I think that would be a symbolic gesture that would be important. So I think you could have this layered approach to a security guarantee that Turkey could play an important role. But on Turkey's role specifically in this current context of what may or may not happen later this week, it is a testament to Ankara's ability to engage with both sides and President Erdogan's willingness from the very beginning to try to broker a peaceful outcome to this fighting. But also, I think maybe Moscow will be a little cautious or a little hesitant here with this because, I mean, one only has to look at the history of the region over the past 300, 400 years to know that Turkey and the Russians are natural competitors in this region and sometimes adversaries. And it benefits Turkey that Russia is weaker in the Black Sea. No Turkish policymaker will ever say this. No Turkish leader will publicly announce this, but everyone knows this because of the history. And if you speak to Ukrainian officials in Ukraine, they will tell you that, they think on balance, yes, Erdogan has continued with the economic relationship with Russia, continued with the outreach, the energy cooperation with Russia. But on balance, the actions taken by Turkey have been beneficial for Ukraine more than Russia. But regardless, both sides seem to trust President Erdogan's statesmanship on this matter. And I think in a way, President Putin announcing this possible meeting in Istanbul the way he did tells us two things. Firstly, the fact that he decided to make an announcement that there might be a meeting later in the week in Istanbul at 1 a.m. in the morning, local time, on a weekend, tells me that things may not be going as smoothly for him as many might think. And then secondly, I think it was a snub to Donald Trump, who honestly at this point in the process seems to have lost any control, or at least control of the narrative about this peace process. And I think Putin going direct to President Erdogan and direct to Turkey was a snub to President Trump, which President Trump, would never admit to it. And he quickly says, oh, yes, this is a great idea. It should be done this way. So I think those were the two kind of messages we got from the way Putin announced this. But I do hope that on Thursday we can get the beginning of what I hope will be a just and secure peace agreement between Russia and Ukraine. But if we do, Western policymakers should not be naive enough to think that this will be it. This may stop the fighting for a temporary amount of time, but Russia eventually will be back to try to finish the job for the reasons that Ambassador Herbst mentioned.
Thank you very much, Luke. And we will have questions on your and Ambassador statements. By the way, for our attendees and for those who are watching us on social media, if you have any questions to participants, the panelists, please write down your questions to Q&A box or the comment box on the social media so that our assistants can collect the questions and we can address to these to our panelists. Mark, the stage is yours.
Great, thank you very much. Well, a disadvantage of speaking last is that I don't disagree with anything that my two colleagues had to say. I think Ambassador Herbst laid out exactly what the situation is, and I certainly don't differ with him on that. And I think that Luke, his ideas about what would constitute an agreement were eminently sensible. I guess my only comment to say is that because they are so sensible, Russia will not accept them. I don't think that Vladimir Putin is actually interested in bringing an end to the war. I think that I think that he was, in a certain sense, hoisted by his own petard. The Trump administration came in essentially, with a very negative attitude toward the Biden administration's support for Zelensky. They didn't like Zelensky. Anyway, we all saw what happened at the White House meeting. I think Trump had this sense that, he and Putin could reach a deal, and that Zelensky was sort of a troublemaker. But then Zelensky seems to have, done as much to accommodate Trump as possible. And I think basically set up a situation in which the Ukrainians have shown that they will work with the United States. Will Russia do so? And I think that what's fairly clear is that Putin is not so willing to do so. He doesn't really, want to make any kinds of concessions. I also think that, obviously this past fall, it appeared that the Russians were really doing well against the Ukrainians. In recent weeks, their rate of advance has slowed down considerably. And I think that, the war is not, I think, going all that well for Russia. I also think that Putin, may be in a bubble, that he's not necessarily. I mean, this was certainly the case at the beginning of the war, and I think it's true now. I don't think he necessarily understands the true situation, and I think that his ideas of sending his some of his close aides to Istanbul, that he doesn't want to talk to Zelensky about this. And so I just think that his aides, they know what they need to say to him to keep their positions, that that they're not going to risk their own careers on this. And so, I think that the diplomacy of this meeting, Putin's suggestion and Zelensky, taking him up on this, it's essentially to convince, each of them is trying to convince Donald Trump that they're the more reasonable actor. And I think what's happened is that we have seen an evolution in these first few months of the Trump administration to tending to blame Zelensky for the continuation of the war, to an understanding that Putin really doesn't want to make concessions. Even Vice President J.D. Vance seems to have admitted this. And so then I think what we're going to see is a situation, whether there's a meeting or not in Ankara, or in Istanbul, that we're not going to see any real serious Russian concessions. And then the question is, does Trump join the Europeans in imposing additional sanctions on Russia, giving additional support to Ukraine? That's what I think is what Putin is hoping he can prevent. But that's I think sort of the whole diplomacy of this is to focus on Donald Trump. Now we were asked to talk a little bit about the role of Turkey. I would disagree with Kilik just a little bit, in a sense. I think there's actually a lot of countries that can speak with both the West and Russia, but there are very few who can play this role of talking with the two leaders seriously about this. And obviously, Turkey is one of these. Now, the question though is, what, just like with Oman serving as a mediator between the U.S. and Iran, it's not clear that the mediator can really influence the direction of what happens. In other words, that mediators aren't necessarily in a position to either apply sticks or offer carrots to the two sides, or at least not do so publicly. The one thing I will say about President Erdogan and Turkey in general is that President Erdogan, I think, is one of the few leaders who has maintained relatively good relations with Putin. He hasn't always had them. At the same time, thwarting Russian ambitions in various places, whether it's Libya, Syria, or the South Caucasus. It really is pretty remarkable. And I think that President Erdogan, his example, I think, it should be learned from the West, that in fact there are so many Western leaders, and I think Donald Trump in particular, who are so frightened of pushing back against Russia too hard, that this could lead to disaster. I think what President Erdogan has shown is that you can do this and still work with them. That you can put the Russians in a position where that they don't have much choice but to work with you. And that's all I'll say for now.
Thank you very much. And now I got set of questions actually from the audience and also the attendees, also from the social media. The first question is to Ambassador. Ambassador, the question is, what are the most realistic pathways to a negotiated peace in Ukraine, given the current military and political stalemate?
You're muted.
You are muted.
Ambassador.
Thank you, Luke. Look, there's a reality that many people are reluctant to admit. Again, Putin's objective is to have political control of Ukraine. And given the atrocities that occupying Russian forces have visited upon Ukrainians in occupied Ukraine, that is something no Ukrainians want. And Putin, at this point, wants to continue the war because he thinks he can win. So if you truly want peace of something other than the Carthaginian kind, which means Russian victory to do whatever it wants with Ukrainians, the smart thing to do is put substantial pressure on the Kremlin, make it exceedingly painful for Moscow to continue this war. That means, one, additional sanctions on Russia's ghost fleet, on the countries that prop up Russia by buying gas and oil from Russia. But two, and more importantly, massive and more advanced weapons to Ukraine to ensure Russian forces cannot pick up one more centimeter of free Ukrainian territory. This is the way to ultimately achieve a stable peace. The Trump team, when it came into office, said that they would put serious pressure on whoever was obstructing Trump's ideas for compromise. They have not quite done that with Russia, except they did make a start. Again, as I mentioned 2 weeks ago, with the permission for American arms, new arms, to go to Ukraine. But they haven't embraced this as the necessary tactic. At some point, they might. The Europeans, recognizing the peculiarities in Trump's approach, have become much stronger in supporting Ukraine. Whether their capacity, both military and economic, is sufficient to achieve the objective of dissuading Putin is a question mark. But if you were to add American power to it, there's no question in my mind that it could be achieved.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. And Luke, the question about the European forces that you mentioned, the possibility of European forces as a security guarantee. The question is this acceptable to Russia? And what will be the conditions of the Russian government in return for a European-based security force?
Well, if you're going to have a just and fair peace, then the Ukrainians should be able to determine what their relationship is with European countries, and if this relationship also includes the basing or stationing of troops on Ukraine's sovereign territory. So the Russians won't like it, but they're going to have to live with it if there's going to be any just or lasting peace. I cannot imagine a situation where the Ukrainians accept terms where they're not allowed to have European troops inside its internationally recognized borders. We shouldn't forget that if Russia stops fighting tomorrow, this war ends. And Russia is the aggressor, Ukraine is the victim here. So it's only natural that the Ukrainians would want some sort of security guarantee, and this, in part, will be formed by European boots on the ground in Ukraine. My only concern is that the Europeans will kind of fudge this a bit. Oh, we'll stick a couple of hundred troops that'll be rotating in, Western Ukraine. And I think it needs to be a little more serious than that. I don't believe in having a tripwire force. I think you need to be in it to win it from the beginning. As a former junior Army officer, the last mission I ever want to be on is the tripwire mission. So I think if we have forces in place, if the Europeans do this, they need to have substantial forces in country, and they need to have the capability to serve as an adequate deterrent against future Russian aggression. But the ultimate guarantee of deterrence will be from the Ukrainians themselves. And that's why there's other aspects to this we have to consider: defense industrial cooperation, continuing to arm Ukraine, as Ambassador Herbst mentioned. We need to look at all of this in a whole. There's no just one component of this that will work. You have to have many different components working together.
Thank you very much, Luke. And Mark, there's a question, and I will try to summarize. If there is an agreement between Russia and Ukraine on this issue, Would this lead to further rapprochement between United States and Russia in regards to strategic matters?
Well, I guess the operative clause in this question is if there's a Russian-Ukrainian ceasefire, then all kinds of things could potentially happen. But this is I think that there are those in the Trump administration in particular who are looking forward to this sort of broader degree of Russian-American cooperation and tended to see Ukraine as sort of an inconvenience sort of on the road to this. But I feel that unless there is this Russian-Ukrainian ceasefire on terms acceptable to Ukraine, that there isn't going to be much broader cooperation. That the Trump administration has talked about various business deals with the Russians, but obviously Washington cannot bind American corporations. And a lot of them have had a pretty negative experience in working in Russia. I don't know many that have had a positive one. So I don't think that, absent an agreement on Ukraine, I don't see, a further improvement in the relationship as possible. If there's such an agreement, probably, then we could well see such an improvement. But, I think that the first step has to be the Russian-Ukrainian ceasefire. Without that, I don't see progress on much of anything else.
Thank you very much, Mark. And now I'm turning to some of the questions from the attendees. And Alexander asked to Ambassador Herbst, how long the Republican Party can accept these Trump policies, in particular to its relations with Putin?
It's an interesting question. It's certainly true that there's a slice of Trump supporters, maybe even as much as 40 or so % of his base, that would be quite comfortable with a quote unquote reset with Russia. We need to remind them that that's an Obama policy which failed. But there is also a substantial number of Republicans who might be considered old-style Reagan Republicans who really believe in peace through strength, who recognize that Russia is, in fact, an adversary of the United States. Russian national security policy says the United States is adversary number one, and that it is not peace through strength to put pressure on the victim in a war against the stronger aggressor. And for that reason, some of the more credulous statements made by President Trump, and especially by Special Envoy Witkoff, have been pilloried in two newspapers that are very supportive of the Trump administration, the Wall Street Journal and the New York Post. And the reluctance that we saw before the mineral deal was signed between Kyiv and Washington to put pressure on Russia was also pilloried by the Wall Street Journal and the New York Post. And even Trump has had to say several times that maybe Putin is stringing him along, although he has yet to act with great energy and precision as if that were true. But Trump does understand, and his sound advisors understand, there are less sound advisors in his entourage as well, that were he to push Ukraine hard for a dissatisfactory peace, a peace that did not last, he, Trump, would look like the world's biggest patsy. And that's very much a look he does not want. So when I add all these things together, and I throw in that Putin remains absolutely dedicated to maintaining the war to achieve effective control of Ukraine, I think that there will be a point when the Trump administration moves decisively against Russian aggression. When that point arrives, hard to predict. But we've seen, you might say, the administration inching in that direction.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. And Luke, will the mineral minerals deal inside the US to provide weapons to Ukraine? And how will Ukraine be able to bring its share to the fund?
This minerals deal kind of drives me crazy, if I'm being honest. I mean, I like the concept. I think it's fantastic that we finally approved it. From the Ukrainian point of view, it ties Trump in more. It gets on Trump's good side. It would give much needed, U.S. investment perhaps to Ukraine after the hostilities end. It brings the U.S. closer, but most importantly, it keeps Trump on board. For President Trump himself, it's great because he's made a focus on securing rare earth minerals a priority for his administration. One only has to look at the rhetoric around Greenland to understand this. So he gets the headline, whether practically anything results from it, it doesn't matter. He gets the headline that, U.S. has secured more rare earth minerals. And I think politically, it could help President Trump working with MAGA Republicans on the Hill. When we have to get a new supplemental to provide more assistance to Ukraine for whatever reason, President Trump can say, look, we got this covered. It's all paid for by the Ukrainians. Like the wall in Mexico was paid for by the Mexicans. These new weapons will be paid for by the Ukrainians. So it helps him politically in terms of his messaging, which I think is a positive thing. So I think this is, again, going back to my earlier comment, the minerals deal is a part of that just peace and that security guarantee. I think maybe the White House believes it's more important when it comes to the security guarantee part than what it really is. President Trump has said, well, if American companies are on the ground near the line of occupation, Russia is unlikely to start anything again. Well, we had troops in Western Ukraine and Russia decided to invade. We had, businesses already operating in Ukraine that didn't stop Russia. So I don't think this minerals deal will stop Russia. But politically, it's an effective messaging tool. It has symbolism. And, if the circumstances are right, it could have good practical outcomes for both sides. But boy, was it a journey to get to this point. But I'm glad we finally crossed the finish line on it.
Thank you very much, Luke. And Mark, Michael is asking, doesn't a ceasefire or cessation of fighting go against Putin's long-range plans to revive the Soviet Empire, including Poland, etc.?
Well, we're not completely sure what Putin's long-range plans are. My sense is that the more he gets, the more he'll want in addition, and that if he can't get what he's after right now, then those more ambitious plans will have to be put on hold. I'm not sure what his ultimate ambitions are, but I don't think any of us really want to find out. I think there's a school of thought that says just make concessions to Putin in Ukraine, and he'll be satisfied. In other words, the appeasement strategy, if you will, from 1938 in Munich, and we all know how that ended. So I think that we don't want to find out. I'd also just like to add one thing in terms of Republican schools of thought on Ukraine. There's also, I think, a lot of Republicans who see China as the greatest adversary that America now faces. And if they have this idea, one sees it referred to as a reverse Kissinger, that somehow, if only they make concessions on Ukraine, Russia would join with the US in confronting China. And the logic is that, well, we're afraid of China and we're a lot bigger and stronger and farther away from China than Russia is. So surely Russia must be frightened in its heart of heart of China. But I don't think that this is the case. And further, I think that Putin has made it clear on certain occasions that, what he would like to see is if there's Chinese-American confrontation, that Russia intends to stay out of it. In other words, that that's in fact something that he would like to see. That he's not going to join with the U.S. Against China. A different Russian leader, who knows, but not this one. That's for sure. He will do everything to maintain his connection with Xi Jinping, and I think Xi Jinping will, reciprocate. But does the relationship depend on the relationship between these two guys? So I do think that those Republicans who focus only on China as the main threat and want to downplay other adversaries have it wrong. We have lots of adversaries, and the fact of the matter is that two of them, Russia and China, as well as Iran and North Korea, are working together. In other words, you can't, one cannot separate them, and they may separate themselves at some point. In other words, that if ever China turns on Russia, that will be an opportunity for the U.S. to exploit. But that's not happening now. We cannot create wedges between them. We can exploit wedges that develop between them, our adversaries, but we can't create them. And so I think that that's an unrealistic expectation that some Republicans have.
Thank you very much. Ambassador, a question for you from our social media followers. If a peace agreement is reached that includes territorial concessions by Ukraine, what precedents might this set for international norms regarding sovereignty and territorial integrity, specifically in the context of the Taiwan question?
Well, I think that Luke made the relevant point that Ukraine's willing to accept this, again, with clear security requirements, measures, but de facto understanding of Russian occupation of Ukrainian territory, not de jure. No legitimacy for Russian troops in Ukraine, including in Crimea. And arrangements like that do not, as a matter of course, infringe on the principles of territorial integrity of states. Again, de facto, not de jure. But there is, in my judgment, a very strong connection between security in the Western Pacific and security in Eastern Europe. It's amazing, but someone who's now in a high position at the Pentagon has made his reputation on the fatuous idea that we can let Putin take Ukraine and that would have no negative impact on on China taking Taiwan. A completely ignorant proposition. Contradicted well over a year ago, after this individual presented this thesis, by the leaders of Taiwan, South Korea, and Japan, who all correctly said that the way to deter Xi from moving on Taiwan is to ensure that Putin loses his war in Ukraine. Any scholar of international relations understands that, as do the people for whom this question is the most important. Again, the leaders of China's adversaries and China's would-be breakfast, meaning Taiwan, and in East Asia. So if we really want to deter Xi, we should be stronger, demonstrably stronger, in support of Ukraine. Because Xi is watching very carefully the reaction of the West, but most importantly of the United States. And if the know-nothings in the Republican Party, who don't understand that Russia, in fact, acts as our adversary, and Russia is the only pure nuclear superpower we've got, right? China's not there yet. We have to stop Russia. And we can do it without losing one American life by simply making sure Ukraine has all the weapons and the economic assistance it needs to achieve the job. And while this is not the policy of the Trump administration, were we to give Ukraine sufficient weapons, there's no question that Ukraine could kick the Russians out of a substantial portion of occupied Ukraine. It would have been relatively easy to do that 2 years ago if the Biden administration had not been intimidated by Putin's nuclear threats. Today, it would be harder to do, but it's still achievable.
Ambassador, there is a follow-up question on this by the same person. Do you think Trump's U.S. would take any step in case of a potential China's military aggression against Taiwan?
That's a very interesting question. In theory, well, we know what the stated policy of the United States is. We recognize that Taiwan is part of China, but any reunification has to be done exclusively by peaceful means. And we have taken many steps over decades suggesting that we would not permit China to do it by military means, although we don't have an ironclad commitment to that. Some things Biden said as president suggested that we would intervene militarily. And he was almost immediately, on the several occasions when he said something of that kind, he was almost immediately corrected by his staff. But even that left an ambiguity, which from my standpoint was very useful, to give Xi one more reason not to go into Taiwan. Trump, in part, made his reputation in foreign policy during the first term by stressing the threat from China. And I would say that most Trump supporters, including those who, again, are fatuous when it comes to the dangers that Russia poses to us, have been pretty solid on the Chinese threat. But there is a strand among his supporters who are actually rather against any American military intervention anywhere. In the Middle East, certainly, besides Eastern Europe, but also in the Western Pacific. I'm not sure I would put Trump in that category, but there are people who have his ears who think that way. I just don't think that will ultimately be decisive. Bottom line, if the Chinese move militarily, I think under Trump, we would be compelled to move, and we should move.
Thank you very much. And Luke, with the Trump administration renewed push for NATO burden sharing and the recent acceleration of European defense autonomy efforts, how does the alliance's evolving internal dynamic affect its capacity to deter further Russian aggression and shape the terms of a Ukraine peace settlement?
Well, I think we have to learn the lessons of history and know that if there is some sort of ceasefire arrangement in Ukraine, this will not be the end of it. Russia will be back. That doesn't mean we can pull U.S. forces out of Europe. It doesn't mean NATO doesn't need its forward land forces any longer. Russia will be a geopolitical challenge for us in the transatlantic community for my lifetime. There's no reason to assume otherwise. So I think NATO has to just continue on with its business. You know, everyone talks about Article 5 of the North Atlantic Treaty, which basically says an attack on one is an attack on all. But Article 6 defines where Article 5 applies. And Article 6 states in the North Atlantic area, north of the Tropic of Cancer. So NATO member states have to be prepared, equipped, resourced, and ready to respond to any military aggression in the North Atlantic area, north of the Tropic of Cancer. And we shouldn't think that just because there's some ceasefire in eastern Ukraine, this is going to be it, because it's not going to be it. History tells us this will not be it, that Russia will try again to finish the job, and we need to be ready for it. So yes, we need to keep boosting defense investment in NATO. We need the U.S. to play a role in transatlantic security. Europe is too, I hate to say this, but Europe is too important to the U.S. for the U.S. to just leave it up to the Europeans alone. It is our largest export market. 46 out of 50 states export more to Europe than they do to China. Europe accounts for 2/3 of all U.S. foreign investment into America. We're talking over $4 trillion with a T. NATO basically is the security guarantee for this economic market that is so important to us. So we have to continue playing a role. Now, you mentioned, Kilich, the point about European autonomy. This needs to be, any advancement in European capabilities, I think, need to be done through NATO, under the NATO umbrella. I like to go back to Madeleine Albright's 3Ds when it comes to European Union defense integration. She said in 1999, there should be no decoupling of the United States from NATO, from European security, no discrimination of the EU by non-EU NATO members, and no duplication by the EU on what NATO is already doing. So I think this is a good place to start. We stick to the 3Ds, and then we go forward in terms of European defense investments and the need to maintain NATO's current capabilities.
Luke, there is a very quick follow-up. Do you expect any crisis in the first NATO summit in June after Trump's second inauguration in regards to Russia?
This is just a thought, and it's dangerous to make these sort of predictions on recorded videos because they will live forever, and I will be wrong, and everyone will go back and say, Luke, you were wrong, and here's the video.
We will not tell anyone, Luke.
Yeah. But I predict that there will not be any meaningful move by Russia to, like, in good faith, sit down and talk about a ceasefire or negotiations with Ukraine until the week before or the week of the NATO summit in June. Because that way the Kremlin steals the limelight, sucks the oxygen out of the room at the NATO summit. It now all becomes less about NATO and more about Russia and what Russia and Ukraine are going to do and what role President Trump is going to play. And I can see a situation where, President Trump rushes off to meet with, Putin because we're on the cusp of a deal. And it's just a huge distraction, and it's very divisive inside NATO, the way this might be handled. So I think, perhaps there'll be a meeting the end of this week in Istanbul, and perhaps like the Kremlin will slow walk talks and negotiations, but I don't think there'll be anything substantial until closer to the NATO summit. So I think that might be the crisis, so to speak, for the alliance next month. But I'll probably be entirely wrong, and this prediction will live on the internet forever.
Thank you very much, Luke, for your brave comment on this. I appreciate that. So we have less than 5-6 minutes actually, but we have 3 questions that I want to address to the panelists. And thanks for your patience for these numerous questions that we are still getting actually. And Mark, what is the impact of the lower oil prices on the Russian economy and funding of the war? And does Putin care about this?
Well, clearly, lower oil prices mean less revenue for him to fund his war effort. So I think he cares about it very much. And I think we've seen a real change in Saudi policy. Obviously in 2022, the Biden administration was trying to get the Saudis to cut back on or expand production in order to keep gas prices lower in the West, and Saudi Arabia turned around and worked with Russia to cut back production. Now I think we're seeing the Saudis expanding production, and for different reasons. It's not just Russia related. It has to do with wanting to punish those people who are producing more than their quota. Also just market forces, with the tariff war taking place, at least the projection of less demand for oil. So these are things that Putin can control, but very much impact him. And so I think that right now, I think going forward, certainly predicting oil prices, you need to go up or down, but it's incredibly difficult to predict exactly what it's going to do. But it doesn't seem that their oil prices are going to be going up. They may be heading further down, but even if they stay where they are, this is and Putin is only selling a lot of this oil at a deep discount. This isn't good news for Putin and his war effort. Objectively, I think that Putin actually could really use a ceasefire. In other words, if he just agreed, okay, let's just ceasefire in place right now, and that's it, that probably the West would lose a lot of interest in Ukraine. Ukrainian domestic politics would, suddenly there would be rivals to Zelensky appearing. That there would be a lot of things that would take Western interest away from Ukraine. But Putin can't even bother to do that. He cannot. He simply cannot do that. It's not within him to do that. And so I think, to tell you the truth, I think that although a lot of people think that Russia has advantages over Ukraine. I think that, as time goes forward, I really think that the balance of disadvantages is going to impinge on Putin. But is he capable of recognizing that? Because it's just so unsafe for his people to tell him anything he does not want to hear.
Thank you very much. And Ambassador, your last question. If Russians are not doing well on the battlefield, why is President Putin not agreeing to a ceasefire proposal? Humayun asks this.
One, the Russians have not done very well on the battlefield for several months, but even so, they've picked up increments of territory. That's the first point. That's the objective reality for what was on Putin's mind. But also, it's unclear he's getting all the facts. It's widely believed that he does live in a bubble, that his aides are afraid to bring him unpleasant information. And so while he may know that Russia's made some gains, he may think they're greater than they are. And he may not understand the great cost that Russia has paid for those gains. So I think that's a factor as well. But I would also add that I think the mainstream media, even in the West, overplays Russian gains and pays little attention, again, to the cost of those gains and the number of occasions on which those gains anticipated gains proved not to be real. So we've been hearing for a long time Pokrovsk would fall in eastern Ukraine, and still in Ukrainian hands, just to take one example. Or also that Kursk, the oblast in Ukraine, which the Ukrainians invaded successfully last August, had been fully retaken, when that's still not true.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. And the last question of the panel, Luke, what would make Turkey a more effective mediator in your view? To what extent does Turkey's domestic developments will impact this mediating factor?
I think because of Turkey's historical role in the greater Black Sea region through cultural links, economic links, geopolitical links, make it the natural power that can engage with both sides in a way that might be able to bring the two sides together. Also, I think President Erdogan, as it was mentioned by someone, I forgot, I think it was Mark, he mentioned how President Erdogan has been successfully able to push back against Russian influence in other regions. And I think this, in a weird way, might be respected in the Kremlin. Like, Turkey is a regional power that has to be dealt with. And if Turkey wants to have a role in the Black Sea, then we're going to have to listen to what Ankara says. And of course, at the same time, Ankara has maintained a good relationship with Ukraine, provided, very quiet but very important support for Ukraine, and has shown, at a time when the Trump administration, at least the rumor here in Washington is that the Trump administration will possibly recognize Crimea as being Russian territory. The Turkish government has been crystal clear just as recently as, several weeks ago, that it respects Ukraine's territorial integrity to include Crimea. So I think Kyiv views that as a source of optimism in its engagement with Turkey. So this is why I think, it's a matter of geopolitics, history, geography, economic links, cultural links, that Turkey is viewed as the natural power in the Black Sea that can engage with all sides.
Thank you very much, Luke, and thank you very much for our panelists. Thank you, gentlemen, for these very important comments and interpretation of what is going on right now. We know that there are a lot of uncertainty, and we hope that this week would lead to a more optimistic picture for the future of Ukraine and a potential ceasefire. And we want to thank for the attendees and for those who follow us on social media. And thank you for the questions. Hope to see you again in our next panel. Thank you again.